So we're on page Chaf Beis. The ninth of the attributes. This one's a bit longer. We might do it in 2 installments. Let's see. V'sashlich b'mitzulois yam kol chatoisom. And you, God, in your mercy, will discard into the depths of the sea kol chatoisom, all of their transgressions. Obviously, the reference here to water and transgression is intended to imply the idea of purification, immersion, spiritual type of immersion in a spiritual mikveh after tshuva, become purified. So he says here, Zo mida tova l'kadosh baruch hu. This is a very good attribute of God's. Shahari Yisrael chatu. The Jewish people sinned, or when the Jewish people sinned, Misaram biyad paroi, v'shava b'tshuva. Okay, no, it is actually talking about the past. Shahari Yisrael chatu, the Jewish people sinned, Misaram biyad paroi, v'shava b'tshuva. He therefore turned them over into the hands of Pharaoh, v'shavu, and they did tshuva, v'shava b'tshuva. They returned in repentance. What did they do wrong in Egypt that they had to be given over to the hands of Pharaoh? From the Torah, it sounds like they went down initially in order to flee from the famine in the land of Israel. And there they were accepted and welcomed and supported by Yosef. And then over time, the Torah tells us they were enslaved by Pharaoh and his people who were concerned that they might join against the enemies of Egypt and try and war against them. But what did the Jews do wrong? The last thing we heard was that Yosef settled them in Eretz Goshen, the land of Goshen, far away from the Egyptians, and that was under the pretense of their being shepherds, which was loathsome to the Egyptians because they worshipped the lamb as their god. And therefore, Yosef said that his people were herdsmen, shepherds, and that was loathsome to the Egyptians. So they agreed to have the Jews separate, and that was really Joseph's plan to make some type of a separation and put the Jews in a ghetto so that they would not be influenced by all of the impurities and the immorality of ancient Egypt. And then we find that the king's heart turned against them, and slowly but surely they were enslaved. It was done very insidiously. Initially, Pharaoh offered the Jewish people very high pay to work and help with the building and the construction. And the more they got, the more they worked, the more money they'd get. And so they went to work with alacrity and with vigor. And after he was able to ascertain just how much they were capable of producing, then he said, now you're no longer will be paid, you will be enslaved, but you'll have to keep up the amount of work that you've done until now. So in this way, he forced upon the Jews to work in a way which he ascertained they were able to do, but this time in slavery. But the question is, what did they do wrong? Because it says here that the Jewish people transgressed. He brought God upon them, Pharaoh, and then they repented. So the Midrash says that, even though it's not written explicitly in the verses, the Midrash says that over time, even when the Shvatim, even when the 12 sons of Jacob, Joseph's brothers, were still alive, and all the more so after, the Jewish people decided that they were going to leave the Goshen ghetto and get on to becoming more and more like Egyptians. And there was a mass movement of assimilation. The Midrash said this already thousands of years ago. Mass movement of assimilation. Initially, the Jews came to the modern nation of Mitzrayim, of Egypt, whose streets were paved with gold. fleeing the famine and the poverty and the suffering of the Jewish homeland. And they went into these ghettos and they set up yeshivas, which Yehuda was responsible for. Joseph settled them there under the auspices of the Pharaoh and so forth and so on. But after the first generation, the immigrant generation, those who were born in Egypt wanted to become assimilated like the Egyptians. Let us leave the ghettos and become like every other red-blooded Egyptian. And as a result of this, the whole program that Joseph had set up to keep them separate and preserve the unique Jewish identity, that whole program was being compromised. So God brought upon them Pharaoh to enslave them, to cause them to suffer in order to cause them to do tshuva. The Midrash actually says that the more they wanted to be like the Egyptians, the more the Egyptians actually hated them. The Egyptians initially loathed the fact that they were involved in hurting and things like this, but they didn't hate them. Only after the Jews wanted to be like them did they hate them and also ultimately not trust them. They're trying to infiltrate their way into our society, and then they'll couple with some other forces from without in order to overcome us. So it's very reminiscent of modern times as well. You think about pre-Nazi and Nazi Germany, where the Jews were despised and hated the more German-like they became, and they were suspected in every field of wanting to ultimately join forces with some international community in order to overcome Germany. And the result was what it was. What were you going to say?
I was going to ask, what is the Jewish homeland that they were fleeing from? Where were they?
Well, they were in Israel.
So they were originally in Israel.
Yeah, at that point.
Went to Egypt to become slaves and then came back to Israel.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. I thought that this was a brand new land that God had promised to the Jews.
Yeah, so no, what happened was that Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, had lived here through different periods. But ultimately, Jacob had the 12 sons. One of the sons, Joseph, was sold by the others, ultimately came to Egypt. And then when there was a great famine, by that time Joseph had risen into control, into power there in Egypt. Ultimately, what happened was that the Jewish clan of the tribes moved down to Egypt from Israel in order to flee the poverty here.
Oh, so they're following Joseph into...
Yeah.
I see. Because he was already in such a high position of power, he basically said, come on,
Yeah.
Come here,
Exactly, yeah. Joseph wanted to be reunited with Jacob, and he called all of his father and all of his brothers and the whole clan to come into Egypt temporarily in order, throughout the years of famine, in order for him to sustain them. And he did so, like I said, by setting up a situation where they would live separately and not be negatively influenced by the immorality of the flesh pots of Egypt. But ultimately, what happened was, and this started happening even when the tribes, the sons of Jacob, the brothers of Joseph, were still alive. But the Midrash says that God did not bring the decree upon the Jewish people until the last of the tribes died, meaning the last of that first generation, the sons of Jacob, died. And then only after did the last of them die that the decree come into effect. By that time, the Jews were seeking to flee this area of Goshen en masse and become like Egyptians.
So was the point of the famine, was it a test to see if they would assimilate into Egypt? Or
probably, yeah, that was probably part of it. Yeah, that was probably part of it. And also to amalgamate them ultimately as a people, that even if they would be enslaved, they would still have the dedication to God and accept Moses as their savior, which ultimately they did.
Abraham was promised that they would go into slavery.
Yeah,
too, right?
yeah.
So it was kind of fulfilling.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Abraham had already been told that that would be the case. Yeah. So the point here is that they transgressed. God brought upon them this enemy. In this case, it was Pharaoh. They did tshuva. Now the question is, Lama ya'anish Paro? Why was Pharaoh punished? Because ultimately, according to this description, Pharaoh is really just a tool in the hand of God to cause the Jewish people to do tshuva. Why was ultimately Pharaoh punished for having done this? And this is part of what he's going to be explaining here. How is it that God orchestrates a scenario where the Jewish people or an individual is liable to be punished, does tshuva, has that punishment, as it were, removed and sometimes even transferred to something else, and ultimately what happens in order to dissipate that transgression, which should have deserved punishment, but was mitigated because of tshuva. Nevertheless, there is this energy of retribution, of punishment, of negativity in the world. What happens to that? How is it dissipated? Right? How is it ultimately played out? And that's all by way of explaining this meter here of God's, as it were, throwing the transgression into the depths of the sea. Okay, so it's going to be somewhat of an elaborate explanation here. But before we get into the author's kind of more elaborate explanation, just the general question here. How do we explain the fact that Pharaoh, in this case, and other cases that he's going to bring, other scenarios throughout history, when God wants to bring punishment upon the Jewish people and does it through an emissary, why is it that the emissary is punished for ultimately doing God's will? So different explanations as to this. These are all somewhat different than what the author is going to use. But before we go into the author's more detailed explanation, some of the other explanations are the Rambam, for example, Maimonides says in Hilchos Tshuva that it's true that God can bring the punishment which is deserving upon the Jewish people through some intermediary, but that intermediary can always choose not to be the intermediary, so that there's still free choice involved. The Rambam says God is going to send the punishment through the Jewish people, to the Jewish people, through some emissary, through some in-between. But God doesn't fix who that go-between will be.
Couldn't it be nature, for example?
It could also be nature.
So really no person is ever obligated to carry out the punishment because he could theoretically do it through nature.
Yeah. We don't. It's interesting. I guess that's it's kind of an interesting question. I never quite thought about it that way, but we don't usually find that it's through nature. We usually find that it's through some nation or through some emissary, like Haman, or Nebuchadnezzar, who destroyed the temple, or Pharaoh, or any of the other the Roman Empire or the Greek Empire and their leaders.
But they make the choices to do that. It's not God that's forcing them to.
That's right. That's what this. So Rambam is explaining it that they would therefore be held accountable for acting as these intermediaries, even though they're doing God's will, because they've chosen willingly to do it, as opposed to deciding not to. We do find instances where there are natural things as well, like the famine we mentioned, or earthquakes and other things. But by and large, most of this seems to take place through like megalomaniacs, through leaders, through other people. I think there also is a story where one of the rulers was coming to lay siege against Jerusalem, and he actually turned back from doing so. And I don't remember exact details of it, but if I could remember more details about it, my inkling seems to be that's an example of how somebody was actually drawn on by God to bring destruction upon Jerusalem, but that would be an instance, an exception really, but an instance where the person kind of rebelled against the mission upon which he was being sent, in order not to destroy Jerusalem, and that would be an exercise of his free will, therefore, to do so. So the person's not forced to do it. That would be one explanation here. I think in that case, ultimately, he did turn around and come back, but there was a time when he was like faltering and he decided he was not going to destroy Jerusalem. I think it was one of the commanders of Babylon, and it had to do with shooting an arrow which was returned. I don't quite remember the details of the story. But that would be one explanation, therefore, as to why this intermediary bring about God's will to, I guess, warn the people, punish them in order to catalyze their tshuva, why the intermediary himself is punished, because he doesn't have to do it. He's also part of the divine plan, but he chooses to be playing that role when he didn't have to. That's one explanation. Another explanation is offered by, I believe it's the Ramban, Ramban maybe give two explanations. One of which is that it's true that Pharaoh, for example, would not be punished for bringing about this suffering of the Jewish people when it was determined as correct by God. But if Pharaoh and others like him are punished, it's because they went above and beyond the call of duty. They went beyond the measure that God sent them, and they intermingled their own kind of hatred and animosity and violence against the Jewish people above and beyond what was called for by God. And therefore, they were not actually punished for doing what was in fact God's bidding, but they were punished for going beyond, for the extent to which they went beyond that. Yeah, that's another explanation. And then there's a second explanation, Ramban. Can't seem to recall it right now. But in any case, the author here is going to be addressing this question then. When we find that God brings punishment against the Jewish people, why is it that he actually punishes the go-between? And he says, "V'chen Sennacherib, also Sennacherib, who was the leader of the Assyrian Empire. V'chen Haman, of course Haman as well. V'domehem, why is it that ultimately they suffered? Sennacherib and Haman." So he says, "Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu misnachem bilvad lomar." God does not suffice it to say, "Shavu b'tshuva." They have done tshuva, they've repented. Imken lo yelem od ra. And therefore, since they're not deserving of any more evil, Imken yistalek Haman melem. So let Haman just let them go, disengage. O Paroi, or for example, Pharaoh, O Sennacherib, he doesn't do that. God doesn't say, well, here, as a result of this public enemy raising himself against the Jewish people, causing their suffering, catalyzing their repentance, now that they repented, I'll just leave the suffering aside and cause these public enemies to disengage. He doesn't do that. Speak. This would not be enough. Ella Yoshuv Amal Haman al Rosho. He actually causes the iniquity of Haman and his likes to be brought upon them, back upon their heads. V'chen Pero v'chen Sennacherib. And also Pharaoh and also Sennacherib. V'hatam. He's going to give the reason why this is so. But there's a note here I just wanted to look at the bottom. Oh, Ches, Oma, Avera. Okay, it's not elaborating very much. But the point is, God didn't say, okay, they got the message, that's enough. We'll stop here. No. He actually brings the retribution upon the oppressors. V'atamnan hagazo. The reason for this particular mode of behavior is basod, having to do with the mysterious meaning of the phrase "V'noso hasair alov es kol avanosam el eretz gzera," that the scapegoat shall carry upon itself all of their transgressions to a land called Gzera. Gzera also means decrees. This is referring to the Torah's description of the Yom Kippur service. We spoke a little bit this morning, if you remember, about the Temple Mount, the Temple, the Holy of Holies, the place in which the high priest went once a year on Yom Kippur in order to try and effect the atonement of the Jewish people. Part of that involved taking 2 goats and making a type of a goral. How do you say goral in English?
Like a raffle.
A raffle, is that what you said? Yeah? Like a raffle, yes, like a type of a raffle. It's probably a more specific word for it, but that's certainly good enough, yeah? And one of these 2 was designated to be used as a sacrifice to God in the temple for the purpose of atoning the Jewish people. and the other was to be sent out into the desert and toppled over a cliff, so that it was dismembered even before it got down to the bottom of the cliff. In either case, the animal died. In the first case, it was sacrificed in the temple. In the other case, it was. Did you get an English word for that? In the other case, it was dismembered. This one that was dismembered, this is what's referred to as the scapegoat, right? The term scapegoat comes from that, right? It was that goat that upon which the transgression of the Jewish people escaped, and was used to make this atonement. The question is, why was there a need for two? And if the one that was offered in the temple was sacrificed as a goat of atonement, so why was the other one necessary? What was it? Number one. And number two, we find that the first one was offered off, slaughtered properly in a kosher fashion, but the other one was mutilated and dismembered in a very inhumane fashion. And ultimately, what is it the poor goat's fault? That the Jewish people sin, so that their transgression is placed upon the head of this animal, and then it's dissipated by the transgression, is dissipated and atoned for by the animals becoming dismembered off the cliff. What is it the animal's fault? Like, what's all that about? So he says, the answer to this question answers the original question as to why is it that Pharaoh or Sennacherib or Haman or any of the other agents which bring about the Jewish people's tshuva as a result of their sin, why is it that they ultimately suffer? Right? The same thing here. So the answer to this question will be used to answer that. And Perusho, this is the explanation of it. She'asoyer nose avonos mamish. This scapegoat literally carries with it the transgressions of the Jewish people.
So the Pharaoh is a sacrificial lamb?
Well, let's wait and see. Let's wait and see. There's kind of an elaborate explanation here. We're trying to understand this. V'zeh kasha me'od. This is very difficult. The Jewish people transgress, and this poor goat has to carry the transgression? What's happening is as follows. A person does vidui. What's vidui? Confessions. He confesses. He does confession, meaning, let's not confuse this with the Christian concept, although, of course, like most Christian concepts, it comes from Judaism. There's an idea of confessing one's transgressions. Tshuva requires confessing that one has done something wrong. It doesn't mean necessarily that he's confessing it to somebody else, but he confesses to Hashem. The point is, he owns up to having done wrong. That's the point. The first criteria for doing tshuva and receiving atonement is admitting that you've done wrong. It's not you have to admit it to a rabbi or admit it to a friend or admit it to anybody else. You have to admit it to Hashem. If the way you've wronged the person, if the wrong the person's done is by wronging another person, then he would have to own up to wronging another person in order to attain some type of reconciliation with the person. Because God would say, don't ask me for forgiveness when your harm to this person is still outstanding. Right? So there, it's not so much that you're confessing to the person as much as you're admitting to the person that you've wronged the person, and thereby you're expressing your willingness and you do what's necessary in order to make restitution to the person. But let's say you haven't harmed another person. A person's transgressed directly to God. So confessing means, or vidui means, he is making known, he's admitting, he's owning up to the fact that he has done wrong. The next step, of course, would be to regret, have remorse over having done the wrong. And the third step would be to accept it upon himself not to do this anymore. So he says here that a person is misvade. He does this vidui. V'kavanaso bevidui l'kabel alav tahara. And his intention when he makes this confession is to accept upon himself, bring down upon himself purity, purification. Kinyan she'omar David, as it was said by King David, Herev kabseni ma'avoini. God, will you greatly launder me of my transgressions? So you see here the idea of confessing one's transgressions, involving a process of purification, which involves the notion of water and cleansing. V'chen u'amarenu, and so we also say, regarding our own confession to the transgressions that we do, marot barachameka harabim, like dissolve our transgressions, kind of, reduce them, marok, dissolve them, reduce them, barachameka harabim, out of your great mercy. Really, some of the things that he's referring to here is the fact that when a person does vidui, where he's confessing, it's brought down, it's related to the word like yidui, yidui, which is referring to throwing. And so what a person's doing, he's actually like throwing his transgression or throwing his knowledge of the transgression out from himself and upon God. He's taking it out from himself and putting it on something else. He's making it known. He's putting it out on the altar of God's awareness so that it should be sacrificed and brought in the honor of God instead of kept within himself. And that requires a sincere intention to do tshuva, like we said, and to have remorse and to accept upon himself not to do this anymore. Like the Rambam says, a person who, let's say, makes vidui, he admits to doing something wrong, but it's really not his intention to correct himself. He doesn't really intend to correct, he doesn't feel remorse over it at all. So he compares that to a person who might be impure, and he goes into a mikveh in order to purify himself, but he still stays holding on to a source of impurity, like a dead animal, yes, a sheretz. Yeah, so he goes into the mikveh, but he's got the sheretz in his hand. So his body is being immersed, but when he comes out of the mikveh, he's still holding the sheretz. He's still holding the source of impurity. So the mikveh is not going to help. So he compares that. A person who does vidui without the intention to do tshuva, it's like somebody who's immersing himself without letting go of the transgression. He's still going to become tameh. But you see here that if he didn't have the sheretz, meaning he did have the right intention to do tshuva, so the vidui would be like immersing himself in a mikveh. The vidui, the confession, is like immersing himself in the mikveh. When he maintains the wrong intention, that's not going to help. But when he does have the right intention, he lets go of that source of impurity that he's holding on to, so he becomes pure. So you see here that the idea of vidui and confession is about purity. And that fits into what he's saying here. That when a person does vidui, he's doing it with the intention of bringing tahara upon himself. Right? He said, Kacha adam misvade, when a person does vidui, kavan also bevidui, his intention with the vidui is the kabbalah of tahara, to accept upon himself tahara, by going in, compared to going to the mikveh. Now here he's not actually going into the mikveh. But the point is, when he makes vidui and he does tshuva, what he's doing is he's bringing down energy from the spiritual realms upon himself, which come flowing down upon him like purifying waters. And this is an idea that we explored in an earlier session as well. So that the vidui, the confession that a person does, the purity that's being brought about, its connection to water and being cleansed, like David HaMelech says, Harbe kapseni me'avonasai, is talking about using tshuva in order to break the type of facades and interposing materials that are breaking between us and Hashem. Breaking through that in order for the divine influence to come down upon, flowing down upon a person in a positive way. And that will cleanse and purify him of his transgression. He might also have to go to the mikveh for other reasons. But we're talking about there being a metaphysical type of mikveh here as well, which is literally immersing oneself in the presence of God through the tshuva that he does. And when a person does this, it's then that we can say that the transgression should become dissipated. It should become dissolved. It should become dissolved. like water comes and dissolves some foreign substance which is attached to a person, so too this divine energy will come and cleanse a person from the foreign energy that he's brought upon himself through transgressing. And therefore, when a person does this vidui, the text continues, about midway through that paragraph on Chaf Gimel, after a period, Eino mispalel ela shehiyu yisurim kolim. What a person should pray for is that he should only have slight forms of suffering. Shelo yeh behem bittul Torah. So that when his suffering that he experiences should not cause a bittul Torah. I'll explain this in a minute. V'zeh she'omrim, and this is also the intention, he means to say, of what we say, Avalo al yedei yisurim roim. Bring upon me small degrees of suffering, but don't bring upon me great degrees of suffering. What he's referring to is as follows. The Gemara says that a person who, let's say, refrains from fulfilling a positive commandment, God says, put on tefillin, and he doesn't put on tefillin. God says, give charity, and he doesn't give charity. So he refrains from fulfilling a mitzvah's aseh, a positive Torah commandment to do. So the Gemara says, if a person does tshuva, eino zaz misham, ad shemochlin lo. If he does tshuva over not having done that positive commandment, so as soon as he does proper tshuva, he's rectified. Everything's fine. If he does proper tshuva. A person who transgresses a lo ta'aseh, a don't. Torah says don't. And the generic don't involves, you guys remember we discussed it also in the morning, the 40 lashes. Transgresses a generic don't. Don't eat pork. Don't tattoo. Don't, whatever the don't may be.
Is that a real one?
Don't tattoo? Yeah. Don't do any of the generic don'ts. And the person does it. Yeah. So it says if he does tshuva, the tshuva is accepted, but it's suspended until Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur, it's atoned for. Yeah? On Yom Kippur, it's atoned for. Yom Kippur atones for. If he did proper tshuva, so the transgression is kind of held in limbo until Yom Kippur comes. And then the day itself, with the tshuva that he had done, will atone for the transgression. So it might be in limbo for 2 months, it might be in limbo for 12 months. It's going to depend on how much time elapses between his doing tshuva and Yom Kippur. Yeah?
Can you do a blanket tshuva? Is that essentially what Yom Kippur is?
It's not as effective. The person has to try and be as surgically accurate with his tshuva as possible. Yeah.
But
So-
an omnibus tshuva.
So theoretically, every night you should do tshuva for that day.
That's true.
Therefore, at the end of the year, when Yom Kippur comes around,
Yes, but there are certain transgressions where even though doing shogah every night, it won't help. For example, the lotas says stay in abeyance, stay in limbo until Yom Kippur.
yeah. But it'll be more precise tshuva.
That's right, and people often keep ledgers and records of the things
All the
that
bad things
the transgressions that they've done, in order to constantly reckon with them and not forget them and recall them on Yom Kippur. In fact, there's a famous story about it must have been the Chavetz Chaim. What's that? Of course it was.
Everything.
Yeah, everything's the Chavetz Chaim, right?
Yeah.
Where he was seen to be breaking down, crying on Yom Kippur, and he had this book that he was reading through, and people were amazed. I mean, how could the Chavetz Chaim have such a long list of transgressions? And he's so upset about them all. What could he have possibly have done wrong? And someone inquired about it, and he said, no, it's not really a list of my transgressions per se. It's just a list of everything that I did every day. He kept a tally of everything that he did at every time and how long it took to make sure that he wasn't just wasting time. And there was one day where there were 5 minutes that he couldn't account for how he used them. And he was broken, distraught over the fact that he couldn't account for how he used those 5 minutes. So those are the tzaddikim. You see, on their level, what it is that they're doing tshuva on. But for us, yes, it would behoove one to maybe make a list. And if not, every time it happens, often people in preparation for Yom Kippur, during the month-long period of tshuva, which is Elul, people try and review the year and think about either specific things or at least general categories of things which they've kind of repeatedly transgressed throughout the year.
But what's the point of keeping a journal if you could do it immediately while it's still fresh and you could feel like a sincere thing for that? Then keeping a journal and then at Yom Kippur just go through the list like, oh, I'm sorry for this. If it's on hold until Yom Kippur anyway, then what's the point?
Of what?
Is there a benefit of keeping a journal and waiting until Yom Kippur to go through everything?
No, I think it doesn't. One doesn't have to be at the expense of the other. Okay, so that yes, to both. Certainly, if the person's done something now and he's in the throes of remorse, he should certainly ride on that wave of regret and do as much tshuva as possible. But if you're talking about a lo ta'aseh, transgression, where we're told that even with proper tshuva now, he's still only fully atoned for in Yom Kippur, so it would still benefit the person to recall it on Yom Kippur as well and ask for forgiveness then, and maybe also in between. If a person's constantly going through his transgressions, then he might become broken and upset and dismayed and depressed and all that, and that would be counterproductive. But there's definitely an idea that a person should keep his transgressions in front of him, either by remembering them. We don't have great memories, so perhaps by writing them down, and from time to time revisiting them, in order to number one, to continue to do tshuva. Number two, to develop strategies to prevent ourselves from transgressing again, and number three, doing tshuva for not perhaps having done tshuva properly beforehand, because in time we might find that we've grown, understand things differently, and therefore can do tshuva in a more effective way than we did initially. And fourthly, like I said, in order to do tshuva on Yom Kippur, when the ultimate atonement for these things takes place. So what you said, is certainly true and very insightful, and it's also holds true not only at the end of every day, where it's true that certain customs certain communities have the custom of saying the vidui, the confession, every night before going to bed, as part of the bedtime shema. The Ashkenazi custom doesn't have it, but the Sephardi and the Hasidic customs do have the custom to actually say the vidui during the bedtime shema. And not only at the end of the day, but also at the end of the week, on Friday, before Shabbos comes in, before going to the mikveh, and also at the end of the month, before Rosh Chodesh, when the new moon comes in. And then, of course, again, at the end of the year, the last month of the year, which is Elul, before Rosh Hashanah comes in. So these are 4 periods which are auspicious for tshuva. The end of the day, the end of the week, the end of the month, and the end of the year. Before going to bed, before Shabbos, before the new month, and before Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So that would be 2 categories of transgressions, either not doing the aseh or transgressing the lo ta'aseh. There are other transgressions where they are lo ta'asehs, they're don'ts, but the more severe category of the don'ts. The ones where we're not talking about the generic don't do's, whose punishment would be the lashes, but rather the don't do's that have a more severe punishment associated with them. Or the point of the punishment is not to punish, but it's to, in a certain way, give a person an indication about how serious this thing is. Idolatry, sexual immorality, things having to do with blasphemy, and other more serious transgressions involving either the capital punishment or kares. Again, topics we've discussed in the morning. It's interesting, again, how all the topics are always so interconnected. Where there, the Gemara says that tshuva is not enough, and Yom Kippur is not enough. A person also has to have suffering. The severity of these transgressions is so great that not only is tshuva not enough, and not only is tshuva and coupled with Yom Kippur not enough, but a person has to have an extra degree of suffering as well. And the explanation here seems to be as follows. Even though we find that for the generic transgressions, doing tshuva and Yom Kippur is enough to atone for the transgression, but for the more serious transgressions, there's a type of spiritual filth or film, a residual degree of transgression, which remains on a person even if he's done tshuva. How is that cleansed? It's cleansed through the abrasion of suffering. Okay? So that the suffering is really, again, not meant to punish the person, but it's a way of making a friction or an abrasion which will clean off any residual remains from the more significant transgressions. So I think that's what he's referring to here in the text when he says, that when a person is doing tshuva and he's being immersed in the positive energy flowing down upon him like the purifying waters of a mikveh, he should ask for the fact that he'll only receive suffering to a small degree and not to a great degree. Why is it mentioned? Why should we be mentioning suffering at all? Once he's done tshuva, it should be enough. No, that's only true for an aseh. Okay. Once he does tshuva and Yom Kippur, that should be enough. No, that's only true for a generic lo taseh. But there are plenty of lo tasehs who are more severe, right? Kares, Misa, death penalty. Yeah. So that he says tshuva, Yom Kippur, and Yisurim, that's going to ultimately purify a person. And what he's asking is that this purifying, this element of final purification caused through suffering should be in a smaller, incremental way than more in a more drastic and severe type of a way. Yeah, what were we going to say?
Somebody who doesn't have their soul disconnected, they do tshuva on a regular basis, and they still die and die as a result of sin. Then, if they're pretty much constantly cleansing themselves and doing tshuva, then what is this sin that they've done which isn't, I guess, forgiven? Because
they haven't gotten around to Yom Kippur mean, or they haven't gotten around to fully cleansing it before they die?
I'm saying dying is a result of sin, right? That's the only reason you die is because you sin.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, ultimately that's true.
So if you're always doing tshuva and you're a tzaddik or whatever, and you don't do any of these like major transgressions, then theoretically every time you do tshuva, and then especially every year on Yom Kippur, you're forgiven for everything you've done. So what exactly is the transgression that kills you?
Oh, well, why should the person die?
Yeah.
It was decreed upon Adam and his progeny immortality. And we discussed this, I think, last week in one of the earlier mitos, that after this transgression, meaning after the sin, mortality was not a punishment. It was actually coming from the graces of God to give people the opportunity, even though it was sending them on a more circuitous route to purity, to be atoned for transgression by the souls going to the spiritual realm and the body decaying in the physical world, ultimately for the purpose of resurrection. But the point is that even a person who's entirely righteous and is constantly involved in tshuva, number one, gosh, I don't want to say is tainted by the original sin, because that sounds very Christian. But the point is that we're still part of the state to which the world metamorphosized, and that's a state of impurity. And ultimately, a person will not be able to be resurrected into the perfected state until they've undergone on this purification process where the body is actually decomposed. That's one answer. Another answer is that the verse says that there's no person who's completely righteous, does everything wrong and doesn't transgress. Everybody's got something. And even the righteous people who might be transgressing in ways which are much more subtle than ours, on their level are going to have to reckon with that as well. But mortality was decreed upon the world, and a person's life does not extend beyond 120. That being said, the Midrash talks about certain people, 4 or 7 individuals, who died not because of the venom of the serpent, but rather purely because of the decree of mortality. But they themselves were so pure and free of sin that, like you're saying, technically speaking, they really shouldn't have. They shouldn't have had to die. They shouldn't have had to die, and they died only because of the decree and not because of the venom. That's what it said about them. One of them was Ishai, the father of David. Ishai, David's father. But in any case, I think since I didn't have my alarm today, we've run out of time, so we're going to have to end here to get you guys ready for the next class. But if I could just think of one sentence to wind things up here, the point here is that that these transgressions, this is what he's getting at, that it's that in the more severe form of transgression, it's this impurity which has to be removed from a person, even after he does tshuva, and this becomes the source for suffering. This becomes the source for suffering, and this is what he's going to connect into, for example, the agents through which that suffering is brought about, the role that the agents play to bring about this suffering for the purpose of purification, and then ultimately what happens to the agents as a result of their role in that purification. Okay, and that will explain what's happening with the scapegoat, and ultimately what's happening with these other agents intended to catalyze tshuva, like Haman, for example, and others which he brought up initially. Well, let's stop here. We'll have to continue tomorrow. B'ezras Hashem.